Welcome, Legionnaires, to the Long Live the Legion podcast, where we talk about the Legion of Superheroes comic book team and break subjects down so that whether you're just out of Legion Academy or you're a longtime veteran, you get to know the team a little bit better. I'm your co-host, Jim.
And I'm your co-host, Jay.
And welcome to episode number 13. What do we have on our mission monitor board today, Jay?
So today, I know we had said last episode that we were to focus on the Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes animated series, but we're going to push that back to the next episode because a huge event happened that we wanted to talk about, and that was, well, we're not going to talk about the passing of Jim Shooter, but we want to talk about Jim Shooter. We wanted to do a Jim Shooter tribute episode because he was so instrumental, so influential on the Legion of Superheroes, and we felt that he deserved his own episode, especially after the sad news of his passing.
Yeah, especially, and we talked about him just a couple of episodes ago when we had our Legends in Intertron. Oh my gosh, I can't even talk this morning. Intertron episode where we were talking about the most influential creators in the Legion over the last 50, 60 years.
Yeah. And he was, I think he's the second most influential writer, and I think you came down on that with the same opinion.
Yep, absolutely. And not only that, but not only was he probably the second most influential writer, but he was. You can make a good argument, and I think we'll talk about this a lot over the course of this episode, that he was the person that jump-started the Legion getting into the modern age.
Most definitely. Yeah, that's something we'll get into as we sort of approach his career. So what I wanted to start with, the first question, just to kind of get into this, is I wanted to ask, like, in your memory, when was the first time that you that the name Jim Shooter entered sort of into your comics knowledge or comics lore? Like, when was the first time you saw his name or you kind of heard about what he had done?
So my story with regards to Jim Shooter is very roundabout. So as I've talked about on this podcast a few times, the post-Zero Hour Reboot Legion was where I came on board. So at that point in time, I didn't really know who Jim Shooter was. I was mainly a DC reader, so I didn't really know the whole ins and outs of the Marvel situation with Jim Shooter back in the 80s and all of that stuff. So I had really no exposure to what he was or who he was in the early to mid 1990s, let's say. So when I come on board to the Legion, I start reading this stuff. I jump on to the AOL and Usenet message boards online at the time in the early days of the internet. Way different than you see things today for the kids out there. People were talking about Jim Shooter mainly because a lot of the reboot issue stories were mined very specifically from some of these classic Jim Shooter stories that he created in the late 1960s. Or, and more likely, they were using characters that he created. And we'll talk about this later, but he created a ton of characters. So all these people online were talking about this Jim Shooter character, and I had no idea who it was. So lo and behold, a few years later, or a year or two later, something like that, this new comic book publisher, comes up called Defiant Comics. And there's this guy called Jim Shooter who's writing this comic book called Dark Dominion. And so I found the same Jim Shooter who's involved with the Legion. So I'm like, let me give this a try. And so I collected the first few issues of that particular comic book because at the time I was kind of into not quite Dungeons and Dragons kind of things, but more the X-Files type, dark alternate universe, hidden, stuff behind the scenes. There's a dark universe going on kind of thing. And it was all right. I can't say that the comic book blew me away. It was very well drawn, but the writing was kind of basic. So I was just kind of like, okay, that's fine. So I wasn't blown away by his comic book writing on reading that. So and then we get to eventually his stint on the 3 boot, and I think we'll talk about this later too. I also, there were some interesting things in there, but I wasn't blown away. And then I think I tuned out of that particular book at the time because I was more focused on the Lightning Saga Legion that was going on in JSA and JLA and all that kind of stuff at the time. So that was basically my main intro to Jim Shooter. And it wasn't until fairly recently, within the last 5-6 years, where I've actually gone back and read those original Silver Age comic books to understand where all this stuff comes from, where this legacy kind of began. And so that's basically my story. How about you?
So I come from a completely different direction on this. So I first got into comics, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before. Like, so I was into the Legion from probably 79, 80, 81, and then you start reading stuff. And if you were reading comics and you were a kid in 1979, 1980, 1981, some people were like Marvel junkies or DC junkies, and they were like, I'm only going to read, or sorry, I guess I should say zombies. It's Marvel zombies is the line. But like, so for me, it was Legion of Superheroes, it was New Teen Titans, and then it was the X-Men. And those were the three books that were the must reads. Like, everybody I knew who read comics were definitely reading New Teen Titans and X-Men, and I was kind of off in my own little world reading Legion. So my first knowledge of who Jim Shooter was came solely from those bullpen bulletin pages that would appear kind of in the back third of every Marvel comic. And it was something that Stan Lee started in the 60s. I'm sure, it's kind of sad, I think, that when Marvel reprints all their stuff, they don't actually reprint these, because they're kind of a really great snapshot of what was going on. And they're written to kind of give you a sense of who's behind the scenes and who's working for the company. And because Jim Shooter was editor-in-chief at the time, he's showing up every week. And I still have this very distinct image in my head, and I actually tried to find this before I wrote a little memorial to Jim. There was a photo in one of these of him in this cowboy hat. And I don't know why this is burned into my memory, but it is. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's one of those Mandela effects where it actually didn't happen and I'm thinking of something else. But to me, that was sort of my first, oh, that's Jim Shooter. And then I kind of started paying attention to him, and this is going to sound insane, because as a kid, I got really tall really quick. So I was about 6'3", 6'4" when I was like 13 years old. So anytime I saw or heard somebody who had a normal job who was that tall, and he, I think, was 6'7", I was like, hey, there's another tall person. I can be connected to that. So I kind of followed who he was, and I paid attention to who his name was, or what his name, and I paid attention to his name every time I saw it. And then as I got more into Legion history and I was buying more of these back issues, I started getting those old Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes that he wrote with Mike Grell on art. And I was like, oh, that's the same Jim Shooter. And then his stuff is always the stuff getting reprinted. So if you're buying reprints, it's Jim Shooter. And those names, and I start to realize how important he is to the Legion and what's going on. But it's kind of funny, like, as you said, it wasn't until like many years after that I actually went and searched out, find that old stuff. Like, I knew he had done it and I'd read some reprints on it, but I'd never gone hunting for it.
Well, now that we have Omnis and all that kind of good stuff and the online activity and online comic book sites between the DCU app and plenty of others that are out there, this is something that you can find out. And I think it's, as a Legion fan, if it's something that, especially for the newer Legion fans, that if you have not gone back and gone to, let's say, Adventure 346 back in 1966, which is Jim Shooter's first story with the Legion of Superheroes, that it's something you absolutely should do, because you can see where everything starts. All these things that we kind of take for granted, I guess, today from a characterization perspective, and all the rogues galleries and even the heroes that are part of the Legion. All those characters start there. I mean, we said this a couple weeks ago when we talked about the influential creators. There was a certain Silver Age style that was very rampant, very repetitive before he started being published in the book, and then he starts, and then the book is vastly changed afterwards. And there's a few. It's funny because I was going through the Silver Age Omnibus, Volume 2, which is where his first stuff starts, and you can see this vast change. And in fact, we were talking about this too on that other episode. There are a lot of these stories that are just silly, that are just, the Legionnaires get turned into babies and all this kind of stuff. And last episode, when we were talking about these kind of things from the perspective of the Bronze Age, you were mentioning that they always have an issue ready to go in case somebody can't make a deadline. In the a few issues after Jim Shooter starts, we get smacked with one of these Legionnaires get turned into baby stories again, and it's obviously it's not a Jim Shooter story because those Jim Shooter stories have a very different feel to them as far from a pacing, characterization, plot, everything. It's a completely different story.
See, I would say if you're going to go back and reread this, and we talked about this on our Silver Age episode, I would say to really understand what Jim Shooter brought is you almost have to go back a year and read the year before he takes over, and then you'll see this dramatic shift.
Oh yeah.
You'll see this change, and you'll see what he brought to the table. And there's a reason why Legion fans look back on him with such reverence, because you can argue, and I think it's a pretty safe argument, without him I don't think this podcast exists, and I don't think the Legion exists. I think
that's absolutely 100% right, and that's and that's why that's why we decided when we heard the news about Jim Shooter's passing, we felt we had to do that. We had to do this episode just because I don't think any of the Legion really takes off without the stuff that he introduces beginning in 1966. So let's pause here for a minute and talk about the way he kind of got into the Legion.
Yeah. So anything that I'm going to talk about as far as his early days actually comes from his website, his blog. So I'm just going to say, so always take that there's a bias there, and I always say whenever anyone remembers the past, especially something that's 60 years ago, it's going to be a little bit shaky. But when the way Jim told the story was basically he's growing up in Pittsburgh, his family is broke, they have no money. As a 13-year-old, he is sitting at home and he realizes he has to get a job. He has to do something. He's got to help out the family. And he's a comic reader. He loves Marvel and some DC, but I think he was more of a Marvel fan. And he said, I can do this. I can write these comics. And then he starts reading the DC stuff and he goes, I can definitely do this. I can write better stories than this. So in his words, he picked the worst title that DC was publishing, which was Adventure Comics, which was the stories of the Legion of Superheroes. And he wrote his own story. Sent it in. They loved it. And they were like, send us more. And he sends in 2 more, and basically he gets contacted by then editor Mort Weisinger, and he's like, yeah, you're going to start writing the Legion. And so I believe he first sent the stories in at 13, but he got hired at 14. Does that make sense?
Exactly right. Yes.
He switches to, and so now he is going to school, and then I believe it is Fridays, he gets on a train from Pittsburgh to New York, and he spends his weekends working on the Legion and working under Mort Weisinger.
Yep.
And I'm going to say Weisinger treated him like absolute garbage. And that's probably a nice way of describing it. Everything I've read is basically it was essentially child slave labor, but on comic books. But Shooter is writing 2 books. I believe he was writing Adventure and Action. So he's writing the Legion. He's writing Superman. And he's just throwing ideas out. And he's like, here's a new character. Here's this. So, we'll talk about this a lot actually as we get into sort of his future career as well, is the amount of confidence as a 13-year-old, as a 14-year-old, to be not only do I know I can do this better, but I'm going to take these steps to do it. And I'm going to take this job. I mean, I think think kind of almost defines his entire career. But just stunning, especially nowadays, to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody who reads comic books and really loves the medium, and I think I certainly kind of put myself in this position. I would love to have been able to do what he did, right? I mean, can you just imagine having the ability to make that kind of impact for so many years for a comic book, and then have that be just used for years and years and years afterwards? It's really kind of amazing. It's in some ways it bothers me that Mort Weisinger was such a jerk, because here's this kid, he's in high school, for God's sakes, doing all this stuff, and but this is the way things were back then, I guess, right? I mean, you have people who are in charge and they let you know it.
Yeah, and there was no sense of like, hey, we've got protection for this or this, or like essentially, I don't know what it's like where you are in Canada. Like this would just be illegal. Like I, without like the parents going, I don't think a 13. I don't. And just imagine putting a 14-year-old on a train from Pittsburgh to New York twice a week like that. You'd never see a parent do that, right? Like everything has changed. Yeah, and it's horrible when you look back and you think about what Weisinger put him through. But there's times where I kind of wonder, like, was just that he was young. He was so young that he didn't realize what he was achieving, and it was kind of that. I kind of wonder sometimes if he was pushing back a little bit. He's never said that he did, but you see the differences between what he did and then what was going on before. And there had to be conversations where Shooter was like, nope, this is what I want to do. And again, the fact that Shooter was like laying out the books as well. Like he wasn't just writing, he was actually drawing the layouts that Curt Swan would then use. Like the more you think about that time, the more like your brain kind of struggles to process it. Like it's just
absolutely.
crazy.
I mean, I'm only making suppositions here, right? But he was basically doing this job all throughout high school, through all of his high school years. So 1966 to 1969, that's basically when he was doing all this writing. And by all accounts, especially from what you were outlining earlier, this was a desperate time, right, for his family. They needed to pay for the house, they needed to pay for their cars, their vehicles, all that stuff. That's a bad place to be in. So when you're scrounging to get whatever money you can, you do what you have to do, right? And I think that from a writing perspective anyway, even though Mort Weisinger might have been treating him like dirt, it's still better than a lot of other things, right? As far as how things that you can do to get by, and to realize that I think by the end of this period, he realizes that he has talent because he's been doing it for so long and getting paid for it. And so, as you see his next steps in his career, where he actually does go to Marvel, I think he really starts to embrace what his talents are.
Sorry, the point I was going to make is I wonder if at a certain point he was bringing in more money than his father was.
Yeah, absolutely he was, because I think his father was unemployed.
Yeah, and I think I think steelworker, but struggled to get a job. I think I'm getting that right. But yeah, I mean, so he's essentially holding the family up. He's essentially paying for everything. And he's, and he's now, I don't want to say the darling of DC, but I mean, I'm sure he was looking in the mirror going like, yeah, I'm the reason why these two books are selling, and I'm making these as good as they can be. And you could kind of see that as he, for the second part of his career, right? Like, so he ends up leaving DC to go to college, but he basically dropped out of college, went to Marvel, and lasted 3 weeks because he couldn't, because he couldn't handle how Marvel was being run and what they were asking him to do. And we'll get into, I want to talk a lot about like his Marvel time, and we'll get into that later. But he ends up going back to DC after he was interviewed in, I believe it was Interlac, like the Legion fanzine. And we can talk about that as well. And then he's like, yeah, like these Legion fans still love me, and DC, I can still get a job at DC. and he goes back and he gets to write Superman and the Legion again. But now, when editors are telling him like you've got to change this, or you've got to rewrite this, or you've got to do this, I don't think he lasted more than a year, year and a half. Like he only ended up writing 12 issues of the Legion when he back in the 70s, because he doesn't want people to edit his work. Like he wants to have complete control.
He's back to Marvel in the 1970s, and it made me wonder. Right, while we're having this discussion and reading about him, reading about his career, if that 4 years of being under Weisinger's thumb just got him to a point where he just didn't want to take anybody's crap anymore. You know, it just made me wonder between growing up in that working class family environment where you have to be kind of tough, and then dealing with those kind of personalities as a high school kid, and then going out on your own and doing what you want to do. And you're like, I've seen this before. You know, you guys can, do what you want. I'm doing it my way. Screw you. I just wonder if that was his mentality going into this.
Well, I think that's part of it, and I think there's a few parts of it. Like the first one is, and I say this having been this kind of kid, there is no more arrogant person on the planet than a 20-year-old who thinks they know everything.
That's for sure. Right,
and so, and I say this with full disclosure. I was that 20-year-old who thought I knew everything, and I was that arrogant. Like there are moments where I'm like, oh, I was horrible. And I'm sure, like, if you're 20 years old and you've been paying your parents' bills for like 5 years, and you've been working under the thumb of this horrible person, but you've learned every lesson that, like, I mean, and you know how to make a comic book, you know how comics work, you understand this, and I'm sure that he looked at, as much as we all look at Julie Schwartz as this amazing editor, and we some people do. I'm sure in the back of Jim Shooter's mind, he was always like, you've been running these Superman books, and these Superman books have sucked for how many years, and I know I'm better than this. Right. Why am I listening to you? Or why am I doing this? There is that, there's part of that as well. And I think that's, there are people who just can't be subordinate. Like they have to be the ones in charge, right? And I think Jim was that person, especially early in his life. I mean, and I think that was part of it as well.
Absolutely.
So what I wanted to go to before we get into like his Marvel stuff is I really wanted to focus on his contributions to the Legion. And I don't want to just make this a list of like, he created this and this and this and this, but like when you look at what he did when he took over Adventure Comics, right? And as you said, it's 346. What would you say were like his biggest contributions?
Oh boy. So just right off the bat, I'm just gonna say, well, the first thing he does as soon as he steps in, he brings in Karate Kid, Princess Projectra, Pharaoh Lad, and Nemesis Kid. As soon as his very first issue, right? So that's one right off the bat. Item number
Here's
two.
Here's my question. Sorry. I just before you get off that. Was this also the first issue of the Coons?
Yes.
Or had they shown up before? Yeah, so he's introducing
the Coons, yes.
Okay.
Yep. And then after that, I would say his big the contribution that made the next big ripple of impact is going to be the Fatal Five introduction. Because it's the Fatal Five is all over the Legion, but also it spilled over into so many different other stories, both in comics, in animation. That is both Legion effective and outside the Legion. So you see them quite a bit. So that's the other big one. And I think number three is a harder one because there's a lot to pick from, but I'm probably going to say Mordru, mainly because you got a chance to see him on water skis.
See, I would actually say I think Mordru's the obvious. I would almost make the argument Mordru might be the second most important
the water
character that he introduced, just because of his, especially nowadays, like everybody's using him. He keeps showing up. Like he's the villain that they keep bringing back. Even, I mean, like that last JSA run when he was the one who appeared. And I think he's one of those characters who just has lasted, has survived the test of time. Like, I'm a big Fatal Five fan, but I mean, uh, they tend to be really dependent on who the writer is. So like good writers handle them well, and bad writers seem to really struggle. Whereas Mordru, I think, like even if you don't really know what you're doing, you're like, hey, we have a big magician and he can, like, and he's got his one weakness. Like everything was kind of created well. And also, I think by the time he introduced Mordru, he was at full power. Like he
That's true.
was like he,
Yeah.
he's at the top of his game, and so everything kind of works. But yeah, I mean, like you say, like first issue, he's just introducing new characters. Boom, boom, boom. The other thing that I think he did that wasn't a character thing, but I wanted to call it out, is it was the first time that the Legion felt like a bunch of teenagers and acted like teenagers. So you had
Yeah.
crushes and you had relationships. Now,
Yep.
he's a 14, 15-year-old boy, and anybody who's been around a 14 or 15-year-old boy knows they know nothing about relationships and they know nothing about it. Like they're pretty dumb about this. Um, so he's trying his best, but like I think of, I mentioned this like Adventure 348 when they reveal that Duo Damsel has a crush on Superboy. And it's one of those things where you think about it, and you go, this makes sense because here's Superboy. Like you would think a bunch of these girls would be like, but and it was the first time it was actually written like a teenage girl.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that.
I always like to, yeah, I always like to call that out, because you start seeing these relationships and you start seeing these pairings, and in a lot of cases, like the pairings have lasted like for again almost 60 years now.
Yeah.
Like he paired Duo Damsel and Bouncing Boy, and in one of his columns he wrote like he actually took Bouncing Boy and wrote him like he was I believe was a friend of his in high school who kind of looked like Bouncing Boy and had the same body type. And if you read the early Legion, like Bouncing Boy's kind of, I don't want to say like he's just this dumb guy who made a mistake and now he's a superhero, and there's not really a lot of difference. But when Shooter takes him over, he becomes a little funny, and he becomes a little charming, and he becomes an actual character. And so when Duo Damsel ends up kind of falling for him, it makes sense. Like you buy it because it feels like a person.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, and I was kind of paging through my omnis around the time about through his time writing, and it was funny because I saw a lot of different just things that have lasted, and it should be noted, right, that Jim Shooter's writing all this stuff. People like the Beer Bombs, Mark Wade, folks like that are reading all this stuff and just eating it up, right? And so everything that we're seeing here on the page that he's writing in the late 60s is becoming ingrained into all these other future creators, into things that they are eventually going to introduce or reintroduce in some cases in the Legion, right? And so I was kind of going through here and looking at some of these stories that get kind of recycled, right? So you have Universo is another big character that comes out as part of this, and his original his original Universo story is basically the blueprint for every other one that comes out afterwards, right? Which I thought was kind of funny, but regardless of who does it. There was another funny thing that I saw here too, where there was this one story called The Revolt of the Superheroines. And one of the interesting things about this particular story, me being a reboot fan, me being a reboot Shrinking Violet fan, was that in this story, Vi goes in both ways. Well, hang on, let me rephrase that. Vi grows in both large and small varieties. So she's, from a size direction. So you know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
So that instance of Vi being able to be just a generic size changer versus just getting really small all the time is something that is here. I didn't remember this reading that, but I'm like, oh my God, I'm wondering if when they got to this point in the reboot, they're like, hey, Shooter did this. let's just make this permanent. It just makes me wonder. And there's another thing where duo damsel at the time kind of becomes duplicate girl. That's another thing that gets done farther down the line. Just these little seeds of ideas that get planted, and given his level of impact and all the people that were creating the Legion that came after him, it just makes me wonder how much, were all these things kind of an homage to all the things that he did in just a really short period of time.
Well, it's funny because you mentioned, Wade and the beer bombs. I think Levitz and Giffen obviously
Them too.
were so affected, because when you read the Levitz run and everything Giffen does on the Legion as well, it is obvious that these books were what really hit them, because you don't, like, the only references that you really honestly get from anything pre-Shooter would be like the Lightning Lad stuff, like Lightning Lad dying and Lightning Lad losing an arm. But aside from that, like, they really ignore a lot of that old Silver Age stuff, and they just go with, what has Shooter done, and they, it's kind of funny you mentioned how like every Universo story is kind of based on this first Universo story, and you can kind of say the same thing. Like, all of the villains come from this section as well. Like, it's the, when the Dark Circle arrives and then they keep getting used, or even Dr. Mantis Morlogue and the Chemoids, which I don't think is a great story, but that keeps coming back. And
yeah.
He, and he's just laying like all of these foundations. The Dominators is something that Shooter brought. Like, all of these characters are coming from these stories, and I would say every Legion run up until what you just mentioned, like the Lightning Saga, I think they are all built on what Shooter did.
And I mean, it's no surprise, right? You mentioned Interlac earlier. It's no surprise that all of these creators, including Jim Shooter, were members of Interlac and participating in that particular newsletter.
Yeah, and if you've ever read any old copies of this, or any old copies of the Legion fanzines, like, you can see this. Like, Shooter's run is, I think, for Legion fans, kind of like that Lee Kirby run on Fantastic Four, or I'm trying to think of another big 60s one, and I'm sure there's tons of listeners yelling at their headsets like, "Oh no, these guys." I think that's, because like, it's like when you read Fantastic Four, everything's built on what Lee and Kirby did, and I think Legion's the exact same way with Shooter and Swan. Like, it's this, and the one thing that really kind of that's really amazing for this, especially nowadays, right? Like, nowadays, comic creators seem to be so scared of giving away creations for free. So almost every comic you read, it's never, or I shouldn't say never, it's very rarely new. Like, it's, hey, here's a different take on this character that was created 40 years ago, or here's a different take. Whereas, like, every issue, he's just, here's something new, here's something new, here's something new. Like, here's, and it doesn't stop the entire run. Like, as you kind of scan over it, like, every first, or every second or issue, it's he's just introduced the Dominators, and then the next issue, now it's Orando, and then 3 issues later, now it's Telok 8 and Shadowlass, and he's just throwing these ideas out, and they're getting. I mean, I imagine if I was a kid reading this, like, this book must have just, like, blown me away completely, especially compared to, like, I know that there's a lot of people who love, like, Silver Age in general, because of the craziness and the insanity, and the fact that it is the complete opposite of what's going on today. Like, each issue is standalone, and it's they can do whatever they want. But there is also, like, a moment where you kind of want a little more depth, and I don't, you're not getting depth from Silver Age Superman. You just aren't. But here you're getting that. Like, I'll give you one that again kind of stands out. Like, Shadowlass coming on and literally I'm looking for a boyfriend. She's kind of moving through the different Legionnaires. So at one point it's like Brainiac 5, maybe, nope. Okay, next. And it's like with Superman, it was just always that, is he going to be with Lois? He's not going to be with Lois. Or what about Lana? And then da da da. And it was the same thing over and over. But with the Legion, we're changing this. And so when she ends up with Mon-El, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I would say so. So let me shift. Let's shift a little bit from the Legion, because I know you were talking when we were talking, I guess, pre-show. You were talking about kind of how Shooter really affected you from the perspective of the Marvel universe, and I'm not as much of a Marvel guy, so I'm really curious to understand kind of where you're coming from.
I'm going to talk about sort of myself as a kid reading this and then sort of on a simplistic level. But then I think we do have to talk about Shooter. Okay, so I'm going to make a very hyperbolic statement that I actually think can be defended, which is without Jim Shooter, I don't know if we have any Marvel movies or actually really Marvel comics at this point.
Really? Okay, I really want to understand where you're coming from now.
Okay, and again, I know this is, I know I'm being very hyperbolic here, but I actually, like, when you look back at what was going on, it kind of I can defend this, and I'm saying this actually expecting a bunch of responses of like, nope, you're wrong, this is crazy. Okay, so as a kid, reading these Marvel comics, and I've written about this before, like when we talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths and how DC was in horrible shape and Marvel was, because DC was outselling Marvel up until I think the mid to late 70s. And then as much as like every Marvel biographer would like to tell you, no, Marvel was dominating, and that's actually not true. DC was still outselling until a certain point, and it kind of happened like around the time when Shooter took over. And then suddenly Marvel starts just pushing forward because Shooter understands fans and Shooter understands a different business model. So as a kid, like Marvel was where the creativity was coming from, especially in the early 80s. Like DC, I mentioned New Teen Titans and I mentioned Legion, but like honestly, aside from that, like if you were reading Superman or Action Comics or Wonder Woman, it really just felt like the same, retreaded stories again and again and again and again. And there was no, how I mentioned like we want characters and we want people. They weren't doing that. I mean, New Teen Titans was and Legion was, and I keep talking about how they were sort of soap operas. But I kind of always use the statement of like, the Legion and the New Teen Titans were kind of the only Marvel books that DC was publishing because Marvel had this system where they were, we're going to tell these long stories and we're going to make sure that you're connected to the characters. And so they were more exciting. And because Shooter's name is on every one of those books and he's the editor-in-chief, as a kid, you're connecting him the same way like Stan Lee was connected to the 60s. So as Marvel is like dominating the 60s, not sales-wise, but just story-wise.
Culturally, yeah.
Yeah, you're thinking he's the reason why, or he's kind of the brains behind it. So as a kid, like it was kind of like I don't want to say like a stamp of quality, but like you knew Shooter was pushing all these books in the right direction. And, I could list off probably 15 books where I'm like, like Daredevil, and you've got Frank Miller run wild, and you've got, the Micronauts where Michael Golden, his artwork, and Bill Mantlow's stories, like they're incredible. And this is a toy tie-in. And the Avengers are great, and Fantastic Four, and then you've got, X-Men and New Mutants and Alpha Flight, and all of these books are just taking off. And then you pull out a DC book and you're like, it didn't hit the same. And so and Shooter was kind of like that, you kind of looked at it as like, he was the reason. Okay. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. I'm following so far.
Okay, perfect. I mean, I know I'm going into like, it's especially tough, like if you weren't around at that time to kind of get into it. And also I'll wax poetic a little bit. So last episode, I talked about how, they had those stories in the drawers of,
right.
And so they didn't miss deadlines. And DC was really good at that. They'd have these stories in the drawers, And so they could hit all their deadlines and they could get the books out and they weren't losing money. Like DC was always the more professional run company. In the 1970s, Marvel was not. Like Marvel was it was the era of the writer editor. So like Roy Thomas wrote, well, okay, kind of wrote his own books and edited them. And Marv Wolfman wrote and edited his own books. And I think Steve Englehart did the same thing. And so you've got a bunch of guys in their 20s who are essentially like running these books. And there are stories of I think it was like Jim Starlin and a few other guys who, hey, we've got a comic to make. We've got like 22 days to get the pages in. Let's go. And it's the 1970s, so let's go take some incredibly potent recreational pharmaceuticals and then we'll come up with a tale. And if they're a month late or 2 months late, who cares? It's going to come out because they're still going to get paid. And they don't care about anything on the editorial side, which is understandable. They're 21, 22. Like, why would they? And so Marvel's hemorrhaging money in the 70s. And also nobody wants to be in charge. They're going through editors in chief like you would go through socks, right? It's literally like one guy lasts for 2 weeks, next person, next person, next person. So finally in like 1978, Shooter comes on staff. I'm going to make sure I get these years right. Sorry. Yeah, so in 1977, he comes on an editorial. And then by 1978, the beginning of 1978, they hand him the editor-in-chief job because nobody else wants it. And he comes in and he goes, okay, let's fix everything that's broken. So he starts instituting the Shooter rules, which if you're, how do I put this? Which if you've never worked under them before, you can't stand them and you leave the company almost immediately, like Roy Thomas. If you're new, or if you're just, or if you like your job or you're getting paid well, you're like, all right, I'll work under this. So for example, a Shooter rule is every comic could be somebody's first comic. So if you read Marvel at this time, every issue at the beginning, they'll tell you who everybody is. But also at the same time, he's like, we have to hit deadlines. So if you're a creator who can't hit your deadlines, bye-bye.
So it sounds like to me, as I'm listening to you tell this story, to me it sounds like he's basically instituting some DC processes into Marvel.
Yes, and he's basically becoming Mort Weisinger.
Well, that's where I was going to go with that, right? It sounds like, in 10 years, he's gone from the kid who's under Mort Weisinger's thumb to basically becoming Mort Weisinger himself.
Yes. And that's what it is. And it's, so he is, and again, like I mentioned before, he is supremely confident. And if you want to be positive, you say he's supremely confident. If you want to be negative, you can say he's incredibly arrogant. But he's going in with the, I know how to do this. I'm right. This is the way. Let's go. And every year that he's at Marvel, he's being proven right. Like the books are selling better. The company is making money. It's making more money. He's instituting changes. And again, depending on whose history you read, he's either essentially copying what DC is doing or he's doing his own thing. But like people are getting paid more. Royalties are starting to come in. We start seeing creator ownership of titles, like the whole Epic line. And he can do no wrong. So the confidence or the arrogance is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, as that happens, you start making more and more enemies. Right. And again, like the reason why I say, like I said at the beginning, like without him, we don't have Marvel movies and we might not have a Marvel company is because like in 1978, like comics industry is dying, right? Nobody's buying comics on the newsstand.
Well, that was around the time of the implosion, right? Wasn't that around that time period?
Right. So DC had this savior of DC's owned by Warner Brothers. So they've got a ton of money that they can kind of protect. They can protect them. Marvel doesn't have that. Like Marvel's just the company. And I think you can make a very credible argument because this is like when he takes over in 78, X-Men hasn't hit. Right? So there's no like there's no characters that are just money generating machines for Marvel. And if they don't fix everything, if they don't clean house, if they don't make everything work, I think you could make a really good case that they don't exist by 1985. Which is crazy when you look back at it. And I know there's a lot of people who hate Jim Shooter who would be like, no. But I think that can.
So basically, if I can distill what you're saying, your thesis is effectively because Jim Shooter was able to kind of rein things in and get people to produce consistent product, that then saved Marvel, which also then started spinning out into animation and all kinds of other things at the time, mainly thinking about the X-Men, the OG X-Men animated series. And then eventually we get to the MCU.
Well, let's just think in terms of like the X-Men, right? So in 1978, the X-Men are a middling book that isn't selling very much. I believe in 78, like they've just been rebooted. And I think they're still bi-monthly. I could be wrong on that. And the first thing Shooter does is he actually starts hiring editors. And one of the smartest things he does actually is he hires this editor named Louise Jones, who would go on to be Louise Simonson when she married Walt Simonson. And she had come from Warren, and she basically like came into, we are going to run these books on time. And you know how when we talk about the Legion and I keep saying Karen Berger is so important.
Yes.
Louise Jones is that for the mutants. And we go from the X-Men being and to, under her stewardship, it becomes this massive thing. I mean, like it is, and Marvel's creating stars and Marvel's letting people be, you're getting different voices that you weren't getting before. I just think in terms of,
well, I guess it just goes to say, it just goes to show, right, that comics as we say often, right, comics is a collaborative medium. And when we say collaboration, we include editors as part of that.
Exactly.
Because the editor, without the editor, you often don't get something of quality because they're the ones that can do the check to make sure that, hey, this is consistent. No, this character would never say something like this, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And again, to kind of tie this all back to what, to the import of the Legion in the 60s, you can draw a very direct line from what he was writing in the 60s and how he was writing those books and what were the rules that he was following that Weisinger had instituted to what he's doing at Marvel in late 70s, early 80s. It's such a like those 4 years have such a huge impact on the world of comics that it's kind of crazy when you look back at it.
So let's move forward in the timeline a little bit because so Jim Shooter is let go at Marvel in 1987, and at this point in the late 80s, early 90s, pretty much most of the 90s, there's this big movement of creator-owned properties in the comics world in general. And so what you see happening throughout the industry are all these labels that are being stood up that are designed to be independent, right? Meaning not part of the Marvel machine, not part of the DC Warner Brothers machine. And so it's very much more supposed to be creator driven. And so Shooter goes and, I mentioned Defiant Comics earlier, but he's also involved in Valiant Comics and Broadway Comics. So he was involved in setting up a lot of these things to try to, kind of have lightning strike again, so to speak.
But it's funny because,
and then we get.
Sorry,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to do a quick. It's kind of funny, like you mentioned, like the creator own and the more creative, but like Valiant Comics wasn't that. Like Valiant Comics was actually him trying to recreate Marvel. So they were all company-owned characters. Like they had bought the old Gold Key characters, like Magnus, Robot Fighter, and Turok, Son of Stone, or sorry, those aren't all Gold Key. There's a few different companies. But the idea was to basically recreate Marvel. So the talent wouldn't own the characters. The talent were essentially getting paid. He wanted a Valiant style, So every book would kind of look the same. He was trying to just recreate his heights. And then I think it was Defiant that he realized, okay, we have to do a little bit more creator owned. But Valiant
Yeah.
was kind of the opposite. So it was funny. Image is going one way and
Yeah.
Shooter's going the other.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. Valiant is definitely trying to be its own universe, basically, and in fact, they even did tie-ins with other properties, right? So it was definitely, not the full independent. It was independent in the manner that it was not one of the big two, but it was not creator owned or incentivized, I guess is the better way to put it. But then eventually we get to 2007, and who comes a knocking back at Jim Shooter's door? But DC Comics asking to write the Legion again.
Yep, that was so I'm going to ask this. Were you reading the Legion through the 3-boot? So you saw all these switches and then you ended up reading the Shooter books?
So my 3-boot story is really weird because I was so the 3-boot started in 2005, and I had just had my wife had it. I didn't have my second child, obviously, but we had a new baby at home. So I wasn't. It wasn't until later in that year of 2005 where I started kind of picking stuff up in early 2006, and so I was able to kind of speed up on the early part of the 3-boot, as we'll probably talk about in another podcast episode at some point in time about 3-boot. I kind of soured on it somewhere in the late teens, early 20s issue wise, and then so I did hear about Jim Shooter coming back to it. I can't remember if I picked it up at that point, because at that point also was the like we mentioned earlier in the podcast, the Lightning Saga storyline was happening in the main DC universe, and I was kind of more bought in and watching the OG Legion, to be honest with you, at the time. So I certainly did not read the end of that run, but I think I might have read the first couple, and yeah, I was, and as I have done my recent reread, as you're in the middle of yours right now, of that era, there were certain signs of life. At the end of the day, I was underwhelmed. So I didn't really think too much of it. But I mean, as we're thinking, because I think that at the time, right, you could see some of the good things that he could do, and some of the not so great things he could do as a writer. And at the end of the day, I'm like, well, I don't want all this bad stuff, and I've been dealing with all this weird, negative stuff in the 3-boot since the very beginning of it. So I wasn't keen on it. When I went back to do the whole reread, I really wasn't keen on a lot of it. So, the whole thing kind of left me with a little bit of a sour taste. But part of me wonders whether, he saw all this other Lightning Saga stuff going on over the other side of the fence in DC, just like Mark Waid did, and he's like, WTF, right? So I don't know if he was just phoning things in at that point.
Yeah, it's a tough one with him because I mean, he did do that big interview kind of letting everybody know what would have happened on this book. And we've talked about this before, not on the podcast, but just you and I have talked about this before. And it's a weird interview to read. And there's times with Shooter with his interviews, and even when he's writing just his blogs, that you kind of question, like, am I reading the actual truth, or am I just reading like kind of what he wishes? And sometimes you're just like, ouch, like. So for me, it's funny with his time back on the Legion. So, and I've mentioned this on my articles, and I think I might have mentioned this. So I dropped the Legion during the 5 years later saga, after Giffen had left, and then the Beer Bombs and Tom McCraw were doing all the writing, and every issue for me just became torturous. And I always would say, like, it's time to drop a book when it moves down the pile, right? Like, you go to the comic shop, you get your pile of comics, you put the ones you're most excited about at the top, and you work your way down. And the Legion was always at the top of the pile. And then with every week, it would drop and drop and drop. And I realized, I'm like, I'm not actually enjoying this. So I just drop it. And I completely miss the reboot, and I completely miss Lost, and I completely miss the DNA stories, because at that point in time, like, I am reading Vertigo and I'm reading like the
Right.
Image stuff, and I am like not like the Image stuff, like the Greg. I think Greg Rucka was hitting at that point, and so I'm like, I want my comics to be a little bit more mature. And then with the Legion, it was just. I know it sounds bad to say, but you keep saying this isn't my Legion. Like I don't know who these guys are. So and then when Three Boot started, I was actually in Korea, so I completely missed it. Um, and then so I come back, and then I kind of I hadn't bought comics for probably 2 years at that point. Walk into the comic shop, kind of see what's there, and I see, hey, Legion of Superheroes, hey, Jim Shooter, let's give it a try. And I still own all the floppies for his entire run on Three Boot, so I know I bought them all. However, as I've been doing these
Right.
rereads, I realized I don't remember most of it because it was just kind of in and out.
Yeah. Well, that's why when you asked where I was from the Three Boot perspective, I like same thing. I have all these. I don't remember reading them. I remember reading pretty much all of the reboot, including catching up on the DNA stuff. I don't remember a lot of the Three Boot stuff after like issue 18, 19, something like that. But I own them all.
Well,
So,
in your defense,
I don't know.
2 kids, your memory's gone. Like let's just
True.
be honest.
True.
Like when you're dealing with babies and young kids, you're not going to remember anything. So you
And sleep deprivation.
So you're just reading this, and so I mean, I joked in a column when I got the first Shooter, and I was like, "Yep, this was the selling point," but it kind of was more just, "Oh, Legion," like, and I had no clue what had happened in the Three Boot. I had no clue what these characters were. So I'm reading this and I'm like, okay, this isn't my Legion. Okay, we're missing some of my favorites. Okay, why is Ultra Boy like the biggest ass I've ever read in a comic
Sure.
book? What's going on? Um, but and I've said this in the columns as I've been writing, like, the art is kind of almost enough. And Shooter, for all of his negatives and positives, and I think we're going to wrap up by kind of talking about him as a writer. He knows how to tell a story. Like it's a story. It's a complete, like he knows how to write a comic book. So on that level, I'm like, all right, I'm not entertained to the point where I'm like desperate for the next issue. And again, like I'm not paying attention to anything. So I don't know about the Lightning Saga. I don't know that the book's going to end at 50. I know none of this. So I'm just reading the book. I'm like, okay, cool, cool, cool. And then it gets canceled. And I was like, all right, well, when's the next Legion book coming out?
Right.
But I think Yor and I like these comments of like we don't remember these and we know we've read them. And I hate to say this, that's going to be a through line through a lot of like more modern Legion stories. It's like when somebody references Brendis or the Bendis boot, and I'm like, I have no memory of that because I read them and was immediately like, I don't care. I have more important things in my head than that. And whereas
Right.
Whereas when so we're going to be doing a Bronze Age episode where we're talking about the Cockrum Grell, run, and those are burned in the brain. So like, I'm kind of not even rereading them to rereading them. I'm scanning them because I'm like, yeah, I know this story. Like I know exactly what happened and I've got images in my brain. Whereas this one, it's like, like it's just kind of there. But having said that, like, we've made this comment about his Three Boot run, which is it's the only time during the Three Boot that it actually kind of feels like the Legion. Right? Like it
feels more like the Legion than it did prior. How about that?
Okay, I'll give it. I was being a little bit more generous, but yes. It's because it's like I mean, we've seen more, like for example, like Phantom Girl, who, no pun intended, had basically disappeared for the first 47 issues, is suddenly like front and center and is actually doing things. And to no surprise, Karate Kid moves to the forefront because it's Shooter, and Shooter put Karate Kid in all of his books. But it's kind of it's everybody, and I'm like, that's kind of what I want to see. That's part of the Legion.
Yeah. Yep. No, I agree. So let's shift over because his. Just to button up the Three Boot, right? He basically officially lasted until issue 49, and then he basically said, "Screw you! I'm not publishing, whatever it is you want me to do for issue 50 if you're going to just cancel it." So they basically brought a ghostwriter in to wrap things up
Do you have
in a
any
very
idea?
untidy way.
Sorry, do you have any idea who the ghostwriter was?
I don't. I do not. It would be great to find out who that is, but all we know is Just in Time is the
So this is my open call to any listeners, because I've done some deep dives online to try to find this, and I can't. It just wasn't a book that anybody cared about, so there wasn't a lot of information. So if you know who wrote issue 50, and I'll be honest, if you wrote issue 50 and you're listening to this, please reach out to us, because I have a million questions and I would love to know what was going on at the time. That is just my open call there, because these ones I always find so fascinating, like what was going on behind the scenes and what was happening. It's just the comic industry has these weird moments, and this is one of them. So just to kind of wrap up like his career, like he finishes in 2008 with issue 49, and then he kind of just rides off into the sunset, basically. Like he does some freelance writing. He's a consulting editor. He's in a lot of lawsuits. And from what I understand, from things I've read, like he's on the convention circuit and one of the nicest people. And like every story I've heard is like, he was just the nicest person to go talk to.
Right.
And which I got to be honest, like if I'm a comics creator, that's probably as good of a retirement as I can imagine. Like I get to meet the fans who love my stuff. I get to talk to them. They get to tell me how my work affected them, and they love my stuff as much as I do. Like that's a good way to spend your last, let's say, 15 years.
I mean, right? I mean, think about it. I mean, who wouldn't be blessed to have the journey that Jim Shooter had, right?
Well, I mean, there's the moments where I'm sure he wishes didn't happen, like when he was burned in effigy at Marvel offices when he got fired.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. That's kind of disturbing.
Or when he's had like a number of big name creators like just come out railing against him, and I mean that's probably bad. But I think like I say, I think the way the fans view him is very different from the way other creators view him, if that makes any sense.
And no, for sure. Well, that's I guess that's where I'm trying to go with, right? Is the fact that you have, he had so much influence early on in his career, before any other creator that we look up to today had the chance to do that, and then be able to be an editor-in-chief in Marvel and do all the other things that he did. I mean, it's quite remarkable.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like his, I mean, again, I made the hyperbolic statement, I don't think Marvel exists without him, but the amount of influence that he had on the comic industry there's very few people that you can put on that level. I mean, ironically enough, another one is probably Paul Levitz, like for behind the scenes stuff that most people didn't see.
Yeah, I agree completely. Well, one other thing that I think we do want to address, because I feel like we'll probably get mail on this if we don't mention it, is the fact that as a writer, or just as a Legion creator, we'll just leave it at that. As he grew, right, as he got older in his life, he had some really interesting ideas about the Legionnaires as characters and what made them tick.
Yes.
And I think this is best illustrated by one of the there was an interview in Interlac that he did in 1976 where he kind of he listed like all of the Legionnaires and kind of what made them tick. And so we're talking about a guy who's in his mid-20s at this point, and let's just put it bluntly, he's very obsessed about sex. And if you go back and read this, I'm going to put this in the show notes. There's a link to the Comics Archaeology website. If you haven't read this, the writer is a huge Legion fan. He has a lot of really good articles. I highly recommend the website. But anyway, what he did, he came in and kind of collated all the write-ups about all these characters, in addition to the ones that Tom and Mary Bierbaum did several years later. It just, the reading of them is really kind of, well, uncomfortable about some of these characters in some ways. But there's also there seems to be this very strong theme of sex in a lot of his work, which is fine, I guess, right? No, I'm not trying to be a prude about it, but as we see it in the 3 boot, it pops up there in many instances, and I just think that's that's part of his MO as he got older as a writer.
Okay, so you can't reference this without giving us at least a couple of these descriptions. So
okay,
yeah.
Hang on a second. So here's the one. So I'll cover a couple folks that we've done on. So we've covered as individual characters. We've covered the Trinity, right? We have Saturn Girl, Cosmic Boy, and Lightning Lad. So Cosmic Boy. Okay, here's his take on Cosmic Boy. Kind of a yut. Manly, strong, secure, yet no one suspects that he isn't bright enough not to be. Questions of a philosophical nature rarely form in his mind. He is a good counterpoint to Bouncing Boy, having that dumb ego Bouncing Boy lacks. It will shave around his ears forever. On the good side, he is dedicated, direct, and reasonable. He knows his lack of high intellect and delegates the thinking rather than attempting it himself. He is a good leader, quick thinker, if not a deep thinker, and one who relates well to those behind him. Even as a leader, he's a team player. Okay, so that's not too bad, right? Okay. So let's go to Saturn Girl. Pretty much as she's been pictured, an organizer, a businessman-like, clever, smart, competent woman's liber who scared away every guy she met until Lightning Lad, with his overwhelming ego, treated her like a lady, and she loved it. She is a wild, wild woman in bed who undoubtedly has occasionally accompanied Lightning Lad on his forays into Dream Girl's boudoir. So that's really interesting, yeah.
Okay.
That says a lot about several characters in just that one paragraph. Okay, now let's go to Saturn Girl. Pretty much as she's been pictured. Oh, I'm sorry. We just did that one. Lightning Lad is who we're doing next. One of the reasons for his sister's retiring personality. He is a showman and proud, powerful, exemplary hero. A confident, dominant man enough for the likes of Imra, Iron-Ass, Ardeen. Certainly his revival from death has affected him. Doubtless he feels now that he has a great role to play, a mission. He is good. He knows it. He strives for it and will not be denied his place in the heroic limelight.
Yep.
So there you go.
No, it's I mean, I guess that maybe this does explain some of the choices for 3 boot. When they started doing something.
I think it might. I mean, as you go through some of these, you'll see, especially, if you think about, the whole Chuck Tane Luornu relationship, you can guess where that discussion goes. There's a whole thing about Shrinking Violet and having weird sex with Duplicate Boy. Sun Boy, don't even get me started on his Dream Girl entry. I mean, it's just kind of it's a whole paragraph of kind of misogyny.
Yeah.
So, which is kind of a weird thing, right? He had this his idea of Pharaoh Lad was to make him black, right, when he was introduced, and that was shot down by Mort Weisinger. He has these very controversial views of the characters here that were published in Interlac. When he was in Marvel, right, one of the things I do know about his career in Marvel was that he was a little bit on the homophobic side, especially around the character of North Star.
A little bit is
when
a
we
nice
look
way
into
of putting it. Yes.
Fair enough. But when we look into the 3 boot Legion, he was trying to make a trans character.
It's so it is one of those.
It's one of those situations where folks have. We were talking right before the recording. People have multitudes within themselves, right? So, at certain points of time in his career, in his life, he was a certain way, just as we all are, right? But at the end of his comic book writing career, he was trying to be this, trying to introduce this progressive theme into the Legion, which I think was really kind of cool. But it just shows how folks over time have very different ways of looking at things.
That's very true. Like it's I always love going back to the Shrek quote of, everybody is an onion and we all have layers and we all have different sides of this. And we do change over time. And I'm not going to try to defend like the way he handled North Star. Like when you read those stories, and there are stories of Marvel Comics was a very homophobic place in the 1980s. And
That was DC.
yes, I mean, look, so was the world. Like, and that's not a defense of it. I'm saying
Yeah.
like that's what the reality of it is. But what instead you have to look is like
Exactly.
what are they doing now, or what are they? So I mean, it's kind of tough for me, when John Byrne starts ripping him apart, and then you read some of his quotes, and you're like, okay, dude, like let's kind of hold back a little bit. Or the other one with Shooter is, I was listening to a podcast, and I think it was Dwayne McDuffie talking about how Shooter basically gave him his first writing gig and taught him how to write comics and gave him his opportunity. And so we have a black writer who's getting his chance to write Marvel Comics. And so everybody has these elements, and again, not a defense. I'm not trying to say that anything that happened, especially around North Star, was a good, was defendable. It wasn't. But you have to think of it in what's the era, like for example, like Mort Weisinger not letting Farrelad be black. It's bad. Just as not letting them reveal North Star is gay is bad. But at the same time, you have to go, this is the 1960s, this is the 1980s. And I was telling you before the podcast, like, if you read any comic from the 80s or 90s where they introduce a character who even might be gay, and you wait 3-4 months for the letter pages, it is shockingly horrific to read. People were so openly, so openly homophobic. It's horrible. And it was horrible then, and it's horrible now. But I think as people get older, I'd like to hope Shooter learned a little bit. And I do know one thing that I always kind of cling to that I think is great is homophobia is the phobia that is most quickly ended. I'm picking the wrong word. And all you have to do is essentially meet one gay person and your homophobia just kind of goes away, because you realize like this is a regular person and this is normal. And I hope that's what happened to Shooter. So, and I hope he felt regret about all of this. I don't know, but like, and that's part of the, anytime we talk about these past stories, I mean, I think it was, this just broke on Blue Sky, like this whole story about how like Roy Thomas wasn't actually writing his comics and he actually got other people to do it and he paid them 1/3 of the page rate and he claimed he did it. And I think it was Kurt Busiek who said something like, that's comics history. There's always a door that you open that's never good. There's going to be something bad that you find. And unfortunately, every time we go back into the history of comics, we're going to have these moments and these conversations. And so all I can hope is, Shooter learned and Shooter got better and Shooter got smarter for, just for himself, and I hope he, was much happier by the time everything was done. I don't think him running Marvel was fun. Like, I don't think he enjoyed it.
Well, that's the thing. And there's some things here that we just don't know, or maybe some people do, but I don't. I mean, there's and not to say that this is excusable, but there are people that say and do certain things in the context of being a corporate officer that reports to a corporation with shareholders and all that kind of good stuff, or not so good stuff, and their opinions as a private person. And unfortunately, a lot of times that those are two different things.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder about that time in the 80s, if he was caving to corporate pressure, or if it was just him saying no. I don't know that. That's just saying for me. I just don't know. But those kind of situations exist. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Unfortunately, he did write a story, I think it was in the Hulk, that was really homophobic as well, that got published. So I want to give him as much credit as I can, but I also want to be honest with the, I mean, look, just from what you were writing about his comments about the Legion And then just from kind of reading his books, I mean, the whole Grimbor and Charma story in the Legion is just okay, this guy is into BDSM and this is a weird, like this,
It's a weird
yeah,
fetish, right?
and
Right.
so he,
Yeah.
like you said, like he had issues. To borrow the bad joke, he had a comic publishers company full of issues, and sometimes they would show up, and sometimes, and like I say, hopefully he got better, and hopefully he learned, and hopefully he, I don't, hopefully he, I don't know if an apology is enough, but hopefully he was able to rectify this as he got older. And the problem is with a lot of this stuff is, yeah, we're going to talk about the good things, and with Shooter we can list off a whole bunch, and we kind of there's also the bad things, and that's the problem with dealing with.
But I guess to wrap it up though, I mean, I think we can say that the Legion, if not, I'm not going to go so far to say the world's a better place, but as so far as the Legion of Superheroes is concerned, I think it is in a much better place, and it's very specifically because of Jim Shooter. And I mean, I if I could see him, if I somehow could see him, unfortunately I would never be able to see him at a convention, but if I were to be able to see him again, I would say thank you for all the stuff that you did contribute.
Yep. Yeah. I agree. I think at the end of the day, he's one of the most influential people in the history of comics, and especially for the Legion of Superheroes. And we've talked about that today. And again, I doubt we even scratched the surface on a lot of this, especially Legion related.
Oh yeah.
But I think I will say this: if you are a Legion fan, when you think of what your favorite stories are and what your favorite characters or characterizations, he either wrote it or he influenced it. Like, there's very few people that you can say that character or that story there's no Jim Shooter connection to that. I think we can just leave it at that.
Agree.
Let's yeah. I think we're good.
Yeah, thank you, Jim Shooter.
Yes, thank you, Jim Shooter. And yeah, it's kind of a shame that it's always a shame that it's when the person passes away that we actually sit down and do this. Maybe next time we do one of these, we'll pick somebody who's still alive, so we can actually say, like, so if we ever see him, or if I'd love to do a Paul Levitz episode and actually say, like, so anybody who knows Paul Levitz, like, just let him know how insanely important he is to all of this.
Or maybe bring some of these folks on the show.
That would be awesome. So, well, as I mentioned, if you wrote issue 50, or if you, and I know, and this is a little teaser, we will be talking to a Legion creator in the future, but that's
what
I know. I'm now teasing the audience. Okay. Since we've already gone along way too long, it's funny because we were joking. It's like, the Shooter episode, this will take like half an hour. And of course not. We have mail. We have Blue Sky messages. So
yes,
Jim, please let us know.
We've got all kinds of stuff, and so thank you to all of our listeners. I mean, I can't believe how much email and response we get. So, thank you guys so much. So just want to go just a quick shout outs to folks. We saw Randall has been listening, and he's catching up. He was listening to our influential creators episode, and he kind of had some similar thoughts to us about Giffen, arguably the best and simultaneously the worst. I guess he has a great comment here. His high points were matched by incomprehensibly horrible experimentation and sometimes complete disregard of the subject matter. I think we are in agreement there. So let's see, who else do we got here? Randall also says, I love the Big Four concept and appreciate the perspectives. Wanted to throw a couple of thoughts in here. Inkers, colorists, and letterers. Yeah, I think that's a good thing that we can probably do kind of a follow-up episode on, because I think the combination of pencils, inks, and colors are kind of really important. Cover artists, which we did talk about a little bit, but I think it's a good point, because there's some folks that are cover artists for the Legion that are iconic, but they don't do much from the interior perspective. And then editors, and we've kind of been talking about that off and on ever since that episode.
Yeah, I think if we, I mean,
And then
I was going to say a whole
go ahead.
episode
Sorry.
on colorists and letterers would just be, it's like the minutia you go to. But
You know what? Here's the thing: we could probably still go an hour on it. You know, that's all I'm saying.
at least an hour
So,
to just be.
And then Joe George, he was listening to our last episode, and he says, "I for one would like to hear more discussions of bad stories, especially if you could do something with Old Man Brainy with his blue blockers and puffy coat," which I thought was super funny. He put a picture of Legion V4 number 56, which shows just this, which is that's really funny. And my thought about this, Jay, was that the Legion on the Run storyline would be probably a really good candidate.
Yes, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, this episode that was about when I quit reading the Legion, so that would be that whole thing would be a great candidate for for a bad Legion story. So.
Awesome. Okay, so in the email bag department, so if you want to send us an email, you can just shoot us an email at longlivethelegion2025@gmail.com. Steve Shen emails us, and he's catching up as well. And let me see here. So he says, your commentary in episode 4 regarding how to write LSH now triggered a thought for me. What if you treat 2958 as the start of the Legion, but have the team be teens or young adults in 3025? Imra and Curl and others are aged mentors and generals behind the scenes rather than as part of the active team. The Legion is a 70-plus law enforcement organization with a far larger number of statues in the Hall of Heroes. And also he has another good point here that I'm going to mention. He says, thanks, and I'll be listening. If you guys are gamers, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the 3 great LSH role-playing supplements done back in the 90s, but there's a lot of info that's that's nowhere else. So I'm going to take the first one first. There's a lot to unpack on the first one. I think what you're talking about with kind of the first generation, next generation thing was an idea that they were thinking about for Bendis, but obviously that didn't get traction. My only thought about it, though, is that I think people really want the kind of the classic characters. So we'll see. As far as I like your idea about the role-playing supplements. Jay, I don't know if you have access to them. I do have all 3 of these books, and they're great. But there's a lot of stuff in them, so we'd have to do like one episode that kind of covers them all. So
I'd have to find access to them. So I've seen bits and pieces, but I haven't seen the whole things. So.
Okay, so he has another comment, another email, where he's talking about Abnett and Lanning in response to episode 5. So he says, they were the guys who made me quit the Legion after being a steadfast fan since 1976. They're turning the book grimdark at the end of the 0 Hour reboot robbed me of the absolute necessity for the Legion, its optimistic future. I only came back to the Legion with John's retro boot team and Superman Action and its lead up into the Legion of Three Worlds. Looking at various and sundry pieces of what they did, I'm curious enough to want to piece together a collection of the decade or so that I missed. He has the 3-boot arc digitally, so I've read that for good and ill. I agree. But it's harder to find the Legion Lost and Legion books before the Wade kits and stuff. Still fun, though, to be in my later 50s and now have some comics to hunt down when traveling. So I kind of agree with you, Steve. And as we talked about in the Legion Lost episode, there were a lot of aspects of the, turning the lights out and, kind of making a 5 years later version of the reboot Legion that I didn't sit well with. I know a lot of people did like it because it on the one hand, it pumped up interest in the team and things were happening and it was interesting at that level. Didn't like what they turned the characters into to do that. So that's where I agree with you. I will say that, when we did redo Legion Lost, I did gain a better reappreciation of it because I think I was able to analyze the story a little bit better and realized that I think the inking was the big problem that I had with a lot of the art that made it very, very dark. I think if they told that story but didn't have the inking quite as heavy, I suspect I might have a different reaction to it.
I think as well with any time that they do a change like that, there's always the moment, and I mean, we've referenced this so many times, of these are not my Legionnaires, right? Like you you read it and you go, this isn't what I want the Legion to be. So the first comment I wanted to make is, so you survived 5 years later and the horrible run at the end of that, but you didn't survive Legion Lost. That impresses me. The second part of it, like you mentioned about how hard it is to find, and I've said this a few times. I'm stunned that the Coipel issues of the Legion aren't in trades, just because of how famous he is now. Like I'm shocked that DC hasn't come out even with like the simplest, like here's the first 8 issues of the Legion, like just that part of it, because of who drew them. Like it's Olivier Coipel. Like they should be out, and you're right, they are really hard to find because they didn't sell a ton of copies. So the back issues are always going to be tougher. I know you can get the trades for Legion Lost, but that's about it.
Yeah, you can get the they collect Legion of the Damned and Widening Rifts as the Legion Volume 1 as a trade paperback, and then Legion the Legion Volume 2 is basically Legion Lost as a trade paperback, although you can get Legion Lost in back issue format or from a used old print copy separately as well. But yeah, they've never done anything past that except for Foundations. And I agree. It amazes me because Legion Worlds, the follow-on miniseries, is I always talk about how Abnett and Lanning are just amazing world builders. That series it's a textbook example of how you do that. It's so good. There's elements of that I'm not like 100% on board with, but you can't deny how well it's done from a world building perspective. I mean, it's really good. You can get them all digitally, right? So if you're a subscriber to the DC Universe Infinite app, all of these issues are available to you. So if you have those means to be able to do that, at least for a month or two, and then just get caught up or whatever, I'd highly recommend it. So
and the one other thing I wanted to say is I am 1000% with you on the fun of hunting for back issues. There is no better joy than flipping through that long box and the smell of old newsprint coming up, and you're like, the one that I'm missing. So yeah, as a fellow 50-year-old 50-something person who loves that, I get that completely. So I'm now doing my hunt for.
I tell you what, when I go to conventions, I spend about probably an hour at least just going to different vendors and just going through their boxes. Okay, so a couple more. Like I said, we got a lot. So our good friend Martin Gray from TooDangerous.com has emailed us. He's caught up on the Lightning Lad episode. So again, he's pointing out that Garth can't be identical because she's all woman. She just passed for him because she does indeed resemble him closely, and the Legionnaires have bad eyesight. The very fact that she has no Adam's apple shows that they're not identical. What DC will probably do the next time they retell the story is say that both Garth and Ayla were originally male twins, but Ayla took Profem like Sean Aaron to gain female physiology, but stopped taking it temporarily to pretend to be a revived Garth. That I found to be an extremely interesting take on this. And we haven't talked about that whole Sean from the 5 years later thing, but from the perspective of Garth and Ayla, I thought that was kind of an interesting take.
It would be fascinating if they did it. I would be. Although I mean, my thought is they should just let that story disappear and not retell it. But if they did, that's a fascinating way to do it. Of just have her, her become, like basically have her become male through the drug, but then what happens when Garth shows up again? It's like.
Well, exactly. Well, then she goes back on or whatever. Who knows? But he continues. He has another really good point here. So he continues. He says the Imra married Brody business was so bizarre. Definitely one of those fan ideas that should have remained in the pages of Interlac, Courtney, or whatever. Agree. That Dave Cockrum Lightning Lad outfit is so darn good. Heck, didn't it become the basis for the post-Zero Hour Archie Legion? I think it's basically been the template for every Lightning Lad outfit since, with the only real kind of somewhat exception being the retro boot, where Garth is kind of has that sleeveless look going on with the muscle top. But pretty much every other one since then is been kind of that Cockrum look, right?
Yeah, he's got a few costumes that they just keep using over and over again, right? So like, and Lightning Lad's one of them. It is an iconic. It's just so well designed, and the color choices are so good that you can't, you just don't want to break it. It's like the Phantom Girl costume. Just don't do too much. Keep it the way it is, and you're all good.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay, and then our last email, and we have a couple, but we do have a couple more comments. Our last email is from Matthew Emsley from the legionabstract.blogspot.com, an awesome website. He actually has a really good comment about what should we cover bad stories or not, and he says, I think what you should do is not to focus specifically on good Legion stories or bad Legion stories, but interesting Legion stories, or more to the point, Legion stories that you have something interesting to say about them, because that's what it's really all about, right? That's an awesome point, Matthew.
Yep, I agree. I hope we covered that with the Reflecto Saga story. I think that's why we picked it, is because we wanted, it's a great comment to think about, like, nostalgia versus what my tastes in comics are now. And that came up on Reddit as well, on the Legion boards, of somebody saying, like, yeah, I'm rereading these old books, and it's not something that I would ever choose to read as an adult, but when I was a kid. And I think that's, yeah, I hope we covered that.
I think so. I think so too. I mean, there's always good and bad. Sometimes there's more than one than the other. So, but we do want to try to give it a fair shake, for sure. Then we have a few comments on directly on our Podbean site. So we have Justin, who's been catching up, he says, for episodes 3 and 4, Saturn Girl is certainly both important as a Legionnaire and a comic book character in general. I think she gets done dirty a lot, especially around the reboot Legion, that seem to make her weak against Universo for the other times they fight. I would chalk that up just being comic book power scaling at DC, but also doesn't do her any favors when the Legion at him later. And yeah, I kind of agree. It's all kind of plot contrivances and stuff like that. At one point, Saturn Girl is super ultra powerful to be able to control, to be Princess Projectra for 8 months or whatever it is, but sometimes she's not. So who knows? He also says, I was also never was a fan of the fan design costumes, except for Garth's bell-bottom outfit that never got used. I believe that couples in comics don't have to be sacred, but they certainly must be well written without sabotage or a triangle. And then his last comment is, so I'll put a separate comment on for my takes on this in episode 11. Yes, please do other worse stories. One I like thinking about is the one with Brainy and Dawnstar doing a Star Trek episode and landing on a primitive planet. That's actually a really good suggestion. That's a crazy issue. Yeah. I don't know if you read that one. You read that one, right, Jay?
Oh God, yeah. I've read that multiple times, and every time I go, ooh.
Yeah, the one with because the picture of the scene with Dawnstar with the arrows through her wings. Has all, it reminds me of this. There's a biblical story or painting that has arrows with angels and kind of a similar way. And last comment, Todd Ramsey says, enjoyed this one. Would enjoy some more bad stories. Maybe would be fun to pick your worst single issue stories. For me, Earth War is another story that doesn't make much sense, but I know people treasure it, like you mentioned, those nostalgic readers. So I think that's another good point too. Some of these really bad ones are the iconically bad ones are kind of these single issue stories, and I'm thinking like you mentioned Dr. Mayavale last time. I think is another good
or
one.
The Legion Volume 4 annual, that's the Bloodlines crossover, which
Hey, don't be slandering Jam now. Yeah, we're gonna have to throw hands here. This is just saying.
Yeah. I get it.
Jam was an iconic character. He's iconic.
Yes,
okay?
he lasted so long. So
all right. Okay. So I think that actually does it for our mailbag today.
Perfect. So please keep sending messages on whichever board, whether it's Podbean or it's Blue Sky. And how can they find us on Blue Sky?
So you can find us on Blue Sky at longlivethelegion.bsky.social.
Yes, and any messages there are awesome, and then we always post links on Blue Sky so you know when the latest episode hits. And where can everybody find you?
So I have my Legion Reviews website at jimboslegion.blogspot.com, where I try to post one new comic a week that is somehow Legion related, and I'm epically failing at that. You can find me personally on Blue Sky at jimbofett.bsky.social, on Reddit at jimbofett87, and on Discord as Jimbo Fett on the Legion Fan Club Discord. How about you, Jay?
So you can find my columns where I cover 2 Legion issues a week at jmlonglivethelegion.blogspot.com. You can find me on Blue Sky at jmckiernan.bsky.social, and you can find me on Reddit or on Discord as Drake Burrows. And I think that wraps us up. I think we've covered everything on the Mission Monitor board.
I think we did. So, and next time, I guess we will be talking about the first season of the 2005 Legion of Superheroes animated show, right?
That's the plan. And I would guess we're going to talk a little bit about the new Superman movie. So we'll make sure we put spoiler warnings on that, but I think it's going to be a month after it came out.
I already saw it. I saw it last night. It's awesome. Go see it.
Yeah, there you go. And we will be, the Legion animated series, we're going to talk about season 1. So please go and watch it so you know what we're talking about. I'm already a few episodes in, and I won't let anybody know what I'm thinking so far. But anyways, that's it for us this week. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. So long live the Legion.
Long live the Legion.
Are you tired of watching your beloved characters being tortured by careless authors?
Are you sick of feeling like they could have swapped out all of the painful action and the plot would remain untouched? Subscribe to Books That Burn, the fortnightly book review podcast focusing on fictional depictions of trauma.
We assume that the characters' reactions are reasonable and focus on how badly or well they were served by their authors.
Join us for our minor character spotlights, main character discussions, and favorite non-traumatic things in the dark books we love.
Find us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.